Mythology is crowded with heroes defined by physical strength, but the survivor of its most famous voyage relied on a different weapon, his mind. After 10 years of stalemate at Troy, it was Odysseus who broke the siege. He designed the hollow wooden horse, a deception that bypassed the city walls and secured a Greek victory where a decade of combat had failed. With the war won, his objective was simple. He gathered his fleet and set sail, aiming to return to his island kingdom of Ithaca to reunite with his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. But the Mediterranean Sea was an unpredictable domain. It was ruled by volatile deities and populated by mythical forces that swords and spears simply couldn't pierce. To survive the return trip, Odysseus had to pivot. The tactical brilliance that won the war now had to be applied to a different arena, one where every league traveled presented a new problem demanding a non-physical solution. Early in the voyage, Odysseus and his men found themselves trapped inside a cave by the Cyclops Polyphemus. The giant sealed the entrance with a massive boulder, making it physically impossible for the crew to fight their way out. Recognizing the brute force imbalance, Odysseus engineered a two-part escape. First, he offered the giant undiluted wine until he passed out, allowing the crew to blind him with a sharpened stake. Then, anticipating the giant's cries for help, Odysseus introduced himself as Nobody. When other Cyclops rushed to the cave, Polyphemus yelled that nobody was hurting him, prompting them to leave. The plan worked flawlessly, but as the crew sailed away to safety, Odysseus's ego overtook his discipline. He shouted his actual name back toward the shore, ensuring the blinded giant knew exactly who had outsmarted him. That boast gave Polyphemus the information he needed to pray to his father, Poseidon, the god of the sea. In retribution, Poseidon cursed Odysseus to lose every single member of his crew and to wander the oceans for 10 years. A brilliant tactical victory unraveled in a few seconds of pride. The incident proved a harsh reality of his journey. Raw intelligence, when stripped of discipline, creates vulnerabilities that even a genius cannot easily fix. The dangers of the sea were rarely straightforward monsters. Often, the deadliest traps offered an escape from the pain of the voyage through the comfort of forgetting. When the fleet landed among the lotus eaters, the locals offered the crew a narcotic fruit. It induced severe apathy and addiction, forcing Odysseus to physically drag his euphoric, resistant men back to the ships to keep them moving. Later, the sorceress Circe drugged the crew's rations, transforming them into pigs. Odysseus only survived by consuming a counteragent herb provided by the messenger god Hermes. Immune to her magic, he held Circe at sword point until she reversed the spell. He could outmaneuver spells with divine intelligence, but pushing past the lure of comfort, when exhaustion was constant, required an unyielding force of will. This calculation extended to brutal risks. Approaching the sirens, whose song compelled sailors to drown themselves, Odysseus ordered his men to plug their ears with beeswax. He left his own ears open, having himself bound to the mast so he could safely analyze the threat. This map visualizes the bottleneck he faced next, a strait flanked by Charybdis, a devouring whirlpool, and Scylla, a six-headed monster. Confronted with certain annihilation, Odysseus steered closer to the monster, knowingly giving up 6 sailors to ensure the ship survived. But a commander's strategy only works if the crew executes it. Stranded for nearly a month on the island of Thrinacia, the starving men ignored his direct, explicit orders and slaughtered the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios. The divine response was immediate. Zeus struck their escaping vessel with a thunderbolt. The ship was torn in half, the mutinous crew drowned, and Odysseus was left clinging to a broken plank, entirely alone. A brilliant plan cannot save a group that abandons its discipline. Stripped of his men and his resources, Odysseus would have to rely on his mind alone for the remainder of the journey. 2 decades after setting sail for Troy, he finally reached the shores of Ithaca. But his palace had been occupied by over 100 aggressive suitors, consuming his wealth and demanding his wife's hand in marriage. The goddess Athena warned him that walking through his own front door as a returning king would result in an immediate assassination. She disguised him as a withered old beggar, allowing him to infiltrate the palace and assess the enemy. Inside, he learned that Penelope had been running her own tactical delay. For 3 years, she promised to choose a new husband as soon as she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's father, secretly unraveling her progress every night. A direct assault against 100 men would have been a suicide mission. Instead, Odysseus maintained his cover, observing the layout of his own home to find the one opening where his patience could finally be rewarded. Penelope's final stall tactic was a contest. She declared she would marry the man who could string Odysseus's massive hunting bow and fire an arrow straight through the narrow rings of 12 aligned axe heads. One by one, the younger men failed to even bend the wood. The disguised beggar then asked for a turn. Ignoring their laughter, Odysseus strung the weapon easily and released an arrow that flew straight through all 12 targets. He instantly shed his disguise. Telemachus had already removed the suitors' weapons from the hall, leaving the occupiers trapped and defenseless as Odysseus systematically cleared the room. With the palace finally quiet, the violence of his 20-year absence came to an end. Penelope embraced the man who had left as a young king and returned as a hardened survivor. The epic survives as a foundational text because it elevates a different kind of strength. It proves that surviving overwhelming odds doesn't require divine invulnerability. It requires the relentless resilience of the human mind.